Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. Now, this is a little abnormal, but I would like to take us all down to Cupertino, California, just for a second, because everyone's favorite fruit-related company has just made a staggering announcement that they will be entering the pharmaceutical industry. I currently have the live feed from their presentation, and I'm mic'd in to hear exactly what they're saying, so let's go down there now. It sounds like they're introducing a new drug. It's called eye drug. Apparently, their engineers have found evidence to suggest that eye drug is useful in the treatment of eye disease, an affliction that we all suffer from, given that we look at screens for up to 15 hours a day. But wait, what's this? Okay, they're saying that it's patented in Canada, which is good because we all know how important pharmaceutical IP is to the pharmaceutical industry. But hold on, wait, there's more. They're saying that their engineers have determined that there are over 500 other disease areas closely related enough to eye disease to warrant this patent extending to those disease areas. So good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Whitehead, and myself, along with the rest of Team Innovie, are going to be addressing this question and hopefully giving you all the tools to answer this question by the end of our presentation. Is it possible to patent a single drug for a large family of disease states based on a prediction that the drug will be applicable to those disease states? We'll revisit this question at the end of our presentation.
Good evening, everyone. So to answer Matt's question, actually, Team Innovie will be presenting to you tonight a very important Canadian patent case. Apotex Incorporated and Novapharm Limited versus Glaxo Wellcome Foundation Limited. This will be a discussion of the EPIC IP, or intellectual property battle, for the anti-HIV compound AZT, which was discussed before. For reasons that will be discussed tonight, this patent came under attack by two Canadian generics companies, Apotex and Novapharm. So join my colleagues Matt, Michael, Jason, Melissa, Kara, and I as we delve into the details of the case and explain its significance. Specifically, we will be discussing the jurisprudence or the legal theories and philosophies behind the case and the precedent that it set in the Canadian patent law landscape, specifically focusing on the concept of sound prediction. Our objective tonight is to examine the AZT patent and various strategies Apotex and Novapharm used to attack and invalidate and weaken the patent. We will focus specifically on sound prediction, as this was the very first case, or the most important case in setting out the criteria for sound prediction. Now, I've been talking about AZT as being the compound of focus for this patent discussion. What exactly is it? What makes this compound so interesting? What makes this compound interesting is that is its history, actually. And it was filed, the patent for it was filed more than 2 decades after its initial discovery in a Detroit research laboratory. So in 1964, it was discovered as an anti-cancer agent. This project was not really pursued to a full extent, and later on, Glaxo Wellcome picked it up as an antimicrobial agent. Further in the 80s, there was a huge race by a lot of pharmaceutical companies to address HIV and AIDS and develop the most potent and effective anti-HIV treatments. So in a screen that was performed, Glaxo discovered that AZT was a very potent reverse transcriptase inhibitor, and this is one of the most important results for Glaxo Wellcome. So what did they do with these very interesting findings? This is where I want to introduce to you our battleship analogy. This is the analogy that will be recurring throughout our presentation, and it represents Glaxo Wellcome's patent. And we'll see as we proceed through this presentation, this battleship will be attacked on multiple accounts by Apotex and Novapharm. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, AZT had promising results as an anti-HIV compound, and there was some in vitro results that suggested to Glaxo that they could extrapolate this to human use. So in 1985, they ended up patenting AZT for HIV prophylaxis or treatment. And this really is our battleship. This is what will be under attack tonight, and we'll examine these attacks in detail. In terms of symbolry, I wanted to present these two symbols to you. Throughout our presentation, we'll be referring to the appellants, Apotex and Novapharm, and the respondents, Glaxo Wellcome. And now just sort of a brief history or a case overview. So in 1990, Apotex started producing AZT as an anti-HIV compound, and they also launched a suit against Glaxo Wellcome. This proceeded to the Federal Court of Canada and subsequently proceeded to the Supreme Court of Canada in an attempt for Apotex and Novapharm to penetrate the HIV and AIDS therapeutics market. What were some of the most important issues that were raised? What were some of these attacks that we're mentioning? One of the largest attacks that they launched against the patent is represented by this red torpedo. This attack was based on the fact that GlaxoWellcome did not appropriately establish utility for AZT as an anti-HIV compound at the time of filing. Another, perhaps smaller but still significant attack was the co-inventors were omitted from the patent. So this was another point that Apotex and Novapharm raised. In addition to that, there was a series of smaller yet tactical and strategic attacks against the patent based on certain claims being too broad and therefore inappropriate. And this was an attempt, once again, to weaken the patent. So now let's take a look at the very first attack that was launched on utility not being established appropriately.
So I will be introducing the first major attack to try and sink this entire GlaxoWellcome patent. Now, the appellants challenged the validity of the GlaxoWellcome patent by first claiming that the patent did not satisfy the requirement of utility. So I'm first going to illustrate the basis for this utility attack through an analogy that was presented in our case. The Wright brothers were viewed as two guys who had a speculative idea, and this received harsh criticism from experts in the area for not being seen as feasible. They had observed birds with angled wings for flight and biplane kites that had lift. And these observations allowed them to build their claim that they could build a heavier-than-air powered machine that would allow man to make powered and controlled flight. However, say the Wright brothers were around today, how would they go about claiming that their invention did in fact have utility in order for them to file their patent? There are two paths they could have followed in order to accomplish this. First, they could have developed a prototype in order to demonstrate the utility of this flying machine. However, this would likely be prohibitively expensive and a very lengthy process, and more importantly, the Wright brothers would have risked having someone else step in and claim a patent earlier than them on the flying machine. On the other hand, they could have simply predicted the utility of their flying machine. Now, this demonstrates a huge leap of logic that must be addressed. So, switching gears to our case, but still following a similar line of reasoning to the Wright brothers' analogy, the respondents, GlaxoWellcome, had conducted in vitro tests in mouse and human cells, and these tests showed therapeutic activity of AZT against murine retrovirus. But how did they go about claiming that their drug did in fact have utility in order to file their patent? Now, there are once again two paths that could have been followed in order to accomplish this. First, they could have demonstrated the treatment and prophylaxis of HIV/AIDS in order to prove the utility of the drug. However, carrying out the necessary human clinical trials in order to prove the drug's utility in humans would have been very expensive and, again, a lengthy process. And more importantly, the respondents would have risked having someone else file a patent earlier than them, thus claiming the patent rights in the market for this drug. So on the other hand, they could have translated their in vitro results to humans by simply predicting the utility of AZT in the treatment and prophylaxis of HIV/AIDS. Now, this prediction is how the respondents did in fact claim utility of AZT. And although this speeds up the patent process, how did they get away with this huge leap of logic? Now, in the United States, there is no rigid framework around this leap of logic, and it's simply governed by common sense on a case-by-case basis by a judge. Now, however, on the other hand, in Canada, this leap is defined as sound prediction, and this is what the respondents applied in order to uphold the validity of their patent. Now, most importantly here is that this case actually provided a firm definition for sound prediction, and it established the requirements that must be met in order to uphold or to apply sound prediction. So, what are the requirements? First, GlaxoWellcome had conducted significant research on AZT, and this provided them with a factual basis for their prediction. So having a factual basis is the first requirement that must be met. Next, they completed in vitro testing in human and mouse cells, and this provided them with the sound line of reasoning that their drug would in fact be effective in humans. Now, the inventor must have a sound line of reasoning at the time of patent application from which the desired result can be inferred from this factual basis. So having a sound line of reasoning is the second requirement that must be met. Finally, they filed their patent and disclosed the factual data and their line of reasoning, and this enables any person skilled in the art to make a prediction regarding the drug's utility. Now, we can sum this up into a simple definition, and that is a sound prediction is a prediction of utility of an invention prior to complete testing. And there's two important things to keep in mind here. First is that the soundness of the prediction is largely a question of fact, and it really depends on the evidence from an expert to say that there is in fact a basis for this prediction. So it's not just a legal principle. Next is that the doctrine allows utility to be predicted prior to complete testing, and so this presupposes that further work does remain to be completed. Now, another important aspect of sound prediction that we must take into account is that it really is a balance. We're balancing the expedited disclosure of new and useful inventions in order to benefit the public, but we also need to prevent speculative and unsubstantiated patent applications from cluttering the public domain. So, what was the outcome of the utility attack? Well, the appellants believed that this attack would be successful since utility had not been proven and human tests had not been completed prior to the filing of the patent. However, the respondents fought back by saying that they soundly predicted AZT's therapeutic effects, and therefore this would uphold the validity of their patent. Now, Judge Binney of the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with this concept for the following reasons that Melissa will describe.
So during this lawsuit, the appellants, Biotech and Innovie, attempted to invalidate GlaxoWellcome's patent by demonstrating inutility through two major arguments. The first argument that was made by the appellants explained that the patenting of AZT for the treatment or prophylaxis of HIV in humans was a speculation based on inadequate information and testing. The appellants continued to explain that it is evident that, yes, AZT does work for the purposes claimed within GlaxoWellcome's patent, but for reasons both unknown and unknowable to GlaxoWellcome at the time of filing. So what Biotech and Innovie are saying is that GlaxoWellcome did not soundly predict the use of AZT as a HIV treatment in humans, but instead took a lucky guess, which they say is not patentable. So in response to this argument, Judge Binney of the Supreme Court explains that GlaxoWellcome did in fact have enough supporting data to soundly predict the use of AZT as a HIV treatment within humans. Looking for some assistance, Judge Binney asked for the perspective of someone skilled in the art who explained that it was the knowledge of AZT that GlaxoWellcome scientists possessed prior to patent filing that acted as a foundation for the eventual sound prediction of the utility of AZT in humans. So the first piece of data that GlaxoWellcome scientists knew was that AZT was capable of arresting the propagation of two types of murine retroviruses, friend leukemia virus and Harvey sarcoma virus in murine cells through the performance of several plaque reduction assays. Next, it was also known that AZT worked as a DNA chain terminator, thereby interfering with the reverse transcription step of the HIV virus. This prevents the integration of the viral genome into the host genome, thereby causing the virus to no longer be able to propagate within the host cell. So due to some previous research and development that GlaxoWellcome performed on AZT, it was known that AZT had low toxicity and was well metabolized within a variety of animals, ranging from mice, rats, chickens, pigs, sheep, and calves. And the final piece of the pyramid was provided by the involvement of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. Given that GlaxoWellcome was not equipped to undertake the more sophisticated testing of AZT required, they turned to the NIH to perform experiments in a human cell line, eventually finding that AZT was successful in inhibiting HIV replication in human T cells in vitro. So it is with all of this supporting data that acted as a strong foundation, allowing GlaxoWellcome to be able to soundly predict the use of AZT as a HIV treatment in humans. So as was introduced by Kara earlier, here's how Judge Binney defined the three requirements of sound prediction from this case in more depth. So the first requirement for sound prediction is to have a factual basis. This was determined by Judge Binney to be met by GlaxoWellcome due to the presentation of key results of the in vitro HIV assay involving human T cells, in addition to the information that was known by GlaxoWellcome due to prior research and development on the drug. The next requirement is to have a sound line of reasoning. This was also deemed to be met by Glaxo Wellcome due to a good understanding of the retrovirus life cycle and knowing the mechanism of action of AZT, which is working as a DNA chain terminator. So the final requirement of sound prediction is to have proper disclosure. This was also determined to be met by Judge Binney because the patent possessed and disclosed factual data and a line of reasoning. Information within the patent was deemed to be properly disclosed, as it allowed for someone skilled in the art to make the same prediction regarding AZT's utility in humans. So the appellants made a second argument that attempted to demonstrate the inutility of Glaxo Wellcome's patent. In this argument, the appellants explained that before it could be known whether AZT could be used in humans, some form of clinical trials would have had to been performed. Because AZT had never been administered to patients with HIV or AIDS, critical information regarding bioavailability, pharmacokinetics, metabolic characteristics, and toxicity within humans was not known. And it is only once this critical information is available that Glaxo Wellcome would have been able to file a patent on AZT as a HIV treatment. In response to this argument, Judge Binney explains that clinical data is required for the Minister of Health when dealing with a new drug submission in order to assess safety and effectiveness. When dealing with patent law, however, it only looks at the utility in the context of inventiveness. So since a new use for an old compound is indeed a patentable matter, this means that identifying this new use is indeed considered to be inventive. Additionally, when establishing utility of a patent on the basis of sound prediction, the doctrine of sound prediction in its nature presupposes that further work remains to be done. So given that clinical data is not a requirement for patent approval, and seeing that Glaxo Wellcome has successfully met the 3 requirements of sound prediction with an understanding that further work still remains to be done, utility of Glaxo Wellcome's patent was successfully demonstrated through sound prediction. So going back to our battleship analogy, it can be seen that the torpedo misses the battleship, meaning that the appellant's strategy to attack utility through the demonstration of unsound prediction was unsuccessful in invalidating Glaxo Wellcome's patent, and the battleship therefore still remains afloat.
Okay, so now before I talk about the attack on inventorship, I'm just going to go over an analogy that basically represents the attack on inventorship posed by the appellants. So, now if Glaxo Wellcome was able to identify a new use for AZT, so, for example, treating space sickness nausea in space, they may have to enlist the use of a space exploration company such as NASA. And now NASA may have to create the spaceship to test the proposed utility of AZT. So now the question here is testing alone sufficient to claim inventorship? And that's basically the question I'll be trying to answer. So, now, coming back to the case, in terms of the attack on inventorship, it was found that there was no discrepancies in terms of the original inventors on the patent. However, it was found that the appellants argued that Drs. Mitsuya and Broder of the National Institute for Health were key in identifying the utility of AZT, and therefore should have been listed on the original patent as investors. And pursuant to the Patent Act, Section 53-1, a patent is void if any material allegation in the petition of the applicant in respect to the patent is untrue, and the omission is willfully made for the purpose of misleading. And basically, the appellants were arguing that the omission of the 2 original inventors was a material misrepresentation of the original patent, and therefore it should become void. So, the question now is, how did the National Institute of Health become involved in identifying AZT's utility? So going back to the original filing, or the time of original filing, Glaxo Wellcome was looking to test the AZT's proposed utility. However, they found that they lacked the critical facilities to test AZT. So they looked to a number of outside institutions, and to that end, they found the National Institute of Health, and specifically Drs. Mitsuya and Broder, who were key opinion leaders in identifying treatments for HIV. Now, the National Institute of Health, being a publicly funded institution, signed a confidentiality agreement in terms of the use of AZT, or the unknown compound. However, they did not assign away any of the intellectual property rights that might have been gained through the investigation or screening of this compound. Now, importantly, I'd like to address the fact that the National Institute of Health was primarily working towards helping the public, to find a treatment for a disease that was slowly becoming a national epidemic. And they were not working towards helping the mandate of Glaxo Wellcome. It was primarily focusing on profitability and increasing revenue for their shareholders. So in February of 1985, it was found that the National Institute of Health was able to successfully test AZT in their in vitro proprietary cell line, the ATH8 cell line. And this is basic, and this was the basis of this screening became the basis for the attack on inventorship. So now one important thing to take note of is that the fact that inventorship within the Patent Act does not have a classical definition. And we have to look to other sections within the Patent Act to infer its definition. So the first bubble is referring to Section 2 of the Patent Act, which is the definition for invention. So you can infer that an inventor is any person or persons who conceived of any new and useful art, process, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any improvement thereto. Furthermore, at the time that the patent was filed, Section 34 of the Patent Act basically stated that at the time of filing, a patent must correctly and fully describe the invention to enable any person skilled in the art or science to which it appertains to use. So on the basis of these two sections within the Patent Act, the judge ruled that to be an inventor, you must have participated with the conception of the idea as opposed to its verification. So within the trial court, the judge ruled that the utility as claimed was not established without the extensive and direct involvement of the NIH. Therefore, he ruled that Drs. Mitsuo and Broder of the NIH were actually co-inventors. However, when we're going back to the Patent Act Section 53, a patent is only void if you can show that the omission of the data was a material misrepresentation of the original patent, and the omission was willfully done for the purpose of misleading. So now the question here is, what is material misrepresentation? The appellant's attack on inventorship was focused strictly on the omission of the two doctors on the original patent filing. However, the judge ruled that it was immaterial to the actual patent itself to attack if someone should have been included on the patent as an inventor. Rather, if you want to avoid a patent on the basis of Section 53 of the Patent Act, you need to attack the specific claims of the patent itself. Therefore, the judge ruled in favor of the respondents, and the patent was upheld despite the NIH being identified as co-inventors. Now, taking this to the Court of Appeals, it was found that in a very general sense, testing is not sufficient to claim co-inventorship. Now, the judge made this ruling on the basis of two statements. The first one he made himself, wherein the patentees of an invention for testing do not, by virtue of executing tests using that invention, become co-inventors of every idea that's so tested. And basically, this statement is saying that the National Institute of Health, despite testing and confirming the utility of AZT and with their proprietary ATH8 cell line, they are not co-inventors. Now, the second statement that really set the verdict was a statement done by Dr. Mitsuo of the NIH in 1985, around the time the patent was filed, and where he stated that oxynucleosides, which is a family that AZT belongs to, was likely to be harmful to human cells and thus too toxic to be used in the treatment of human diseases. So this statement really shows that at the time of filing, the doctors from the NIH had no idea for the utility of AZT. And so this verdict, the final verdict was that the National Institute of Health scientists do not satisfy the definition or legal definition of inventorship, and this verdict was carried through to the Supreme Court. Now, coming back to my analogy about NASA, I think we can all agree that NASA, on the basis of testing the utility of AZT's space sickness to treat space sickness, is not enough to claim co-inventorship on the basis of testing alone. And so coming back to our battleship analogy, all of the attacks made on inventorship completely missed the mark on the battleship of Glaxo Wellcome's patent, and the patent itself was completely safe, and the actual attack on inventorship proved to be completely futile.
All right, so at this point in time, our patent is safe and sound. And the strategy that the appellants have attempted has been to target and knock out the central pillars propping up this patent in an attempt to invalidate it completely. They have put together an attack from the point of view of utility, bringing up the concepts of sound prediction. They have also attempted a sophisticated attack on the technicality of inventorship. Both of these attacks have failed, and now we can ask ourselves, is there any other way that a patent can be attacked? The answer to that is yes, otherwise I wouldn't be asking the question. Looking at the Canadian Patent Act, we see that Section 58 specifically allows for attacks on the individual claims made within the patent without affecting the patent's overall validity. So now, in a way, instead of thinking of our patent as being propped up on pillars, we can think of it as being suspended from ropes, these ropes made up of individual cords, and the attacks would now be geared towards these individual cords, trying to weaken the patent but not invalidating it completely. So the patent in question is made up of 78 claims in total, and the appellant's strategy would be to target individual claims, arguing that they're overbroad, insufficient, or ambiguous. The ultimate goal would be to cross out strategic claims, building a workaround solution through the patent. That is, the patent remains valid, but certain claims are crossed out, weakening the patent to a certain degree. Looking at specifically how this applied, in our first example, the appellants attacked claims 1 through 20, stating that these claims make no reference to the use of the drug as a treatment for human retroviral infections. They make no reference to any human disease, as a matter of fact, in these first 20 claims. And Claim 1, as an example, mentions a pharmaceutical formulation comprising AZT as well as an acceptable carrier, but no disease state. And the appellants are arguing that the respondents are trying to patent all disease states with AZT, with these 20 claims. The respondents come back and say that no, all claims and disclosures must be read as a whole. And actually, the judge sided with the respondents on this. And in Claim 21, for the first time, we see the respondents mention human retrovirus infections. The reason for this is an interesting part of patent law, and it's that although claims have an individual character and can be attacked individually, the claims must be interpreted within the context of the entire patent. So the entire patent must be first read, and then every single individual claim needs to be interpreted within that context. In our second example, the appellants attacked certain claims that claimed prophylactic use of AZT against HIV. So not just treatment of HIV, but also prophylaxis. Also, the appellants accused the respondents of not making any reference to dosage, timing, duration, or method of treatment, specifically in reference to prophylaxis. They referenced these things with treatment in mind, but not for prophylaxis. The respondents defended themselves by stating that demonstrated utility or reduction to practice is not a requirement under Canadian patent law. In a way saying, not only have we predicted treatment of HIV with AZT, but also prophylaxis. And in this case, the judge happened to side with the respondents. And looking specifically at this decision, the judge had to make this ruling based on the premises of sound prediction, as were defined within this case. So that's factual basis, sound line of reasoning, and proper disclosure. So in terms of factual basis, we know that AZT is a potent inhibitor of reverse transcriptase. We've also seen evidence that AZT prevents integration of the viral DNA into the human cell. So based on this fact, and based on testimony of expert witnesses or people skilled in the art, the judge concluded that a person skilled in the art would agree that infection with the virus could be prevented after the initial contact. That is to say, a person doesn't have to have a full-blown active HIV infection to benefit from AZT. Somebody that potentially could be infected but not confirmed, that is prophylactic use, is a proper extension of the sound line of reasoning. And as far as disclosure, that was also satisfied because anything that was disclosed in reference to treatment would also apply to prophylaxis. So bringing up one final example, something a little bit more sophisticated this time, the appellants attacked, saying that claims were made for treatment and prophylaxis not only of HIV, but of all human retrovirus infections. The appellants accused the respondents of using terms like human retrovirus infections or an AIDS infection, very broad terms, not specifically geared at HIV. The respondents defended themselves, stating that we know the mechanism of action of the drug, and we know that all human retrovirus infections replicate through the use of reverse transcriptase. So once again, they have soundly predicted treatment and prophylaxis of all human retroviral infections with AZT. And this affected 15 claims out of 78 within the patent. In this case, the judge sided with the appellants for the first time, and they finally scored a hit against the respondent's patent. To see why this happened, again, we must analyze this from the point of view of sound reasoning, looking at factual basis, sound line of reasoning, and proper disclosure. So we already know that AZT is a potent inhibitor of reverse transcriptase, and at this time, we knew that there were 4 human retrovirus infections: HIV, HTLV1 and 2, that is human lymphotrophic virus, and human foamy-virus. At this time, or sometime before, it was thought that HTLV was related to HIV. The judge relied on testimony of people skilled in the art, or expert witnesses in this case, who further brought facts that HTLV1 and HIV are not closely related, with a homology of only 25%. They also said that human foamy-virus is not confirmed to cause any disease. Therefore, there is no utility in trying to patent a drug against it. And lastly, they stated that there are even key genomic differences between HTLV1 and HTLV2. So based on these facts, I think it's fairly clear to us now that we cannot extend the line of sound reasoning past HIV to all human retrovirus infections. However, there was one more key point brought in this case, and Glaxo Wellcome, the respondents, did in fact provide evidence, in vitro data, for the effect of AZT against HTLV1. However, this data was provided by Dr. Mitsuya, the scientist from the National Institute of Health, and he conducted this data independently from Glaxo Wellcome. And since he was not cited as a co-inventor in this patent, the judge ruled that that piece of evidence was not applicable to the case, and ultimately ruled that the sound line of reasoning does not extend to the 3 other known human retrovirus infections. So we had no sound line of reasoning, and naturally disclosure was not an issue at this point, and therefore the judge ruled against those 15 claims and invalidated them. So back to our analogy of the battleship. The Glaxo Wellcome battleship was attacked by many small attacks from the point of view of broad claims. One of them even met its mark. However, the overall effect on the Glaxo Wellcome patent was negligible, and the patent remains afloat and overall valid.
So we can see that through the variety of attacks that were launched at the Glaxo Wellcome patent by the appellants, the battleship remains very much afloat and able to continue sailing the high seas of the patent landscape in Canada. Sorry for the corny reference. So, now I'd like to wrap this all up and talk a little bit about this case's significance and especially why it's important in the patent landscape in Canada. Specifically, I'd like to talk about why the appellants thought that this big attack on utility would work. As Kara and Melissa introduced, these are the 3 requirements for sound prediction. However, they also alluded to the fact that these requirements were in fact born out of this case. So in order to understand why the appellants thought this attack would work, it's important to talk a little bit about how sound prediction was viewed prior to this case. So prior to this case, sound prediction was generally applied to the chemical industry, where it is desirable to apply for a patent not only for a single compound that may exhibit a function, but a family of compounds that exhibit similar function because they exhibit similar chemical structure. And of course, it's not feasible to always test every compound in the family, so testing of a few compounds within the family would suffice if you could soundly predict that that function would extend to the whole family. Now, the seminal case in this regard was 1979 Monsanto versus the Commissioner of Patents. Now, originally, Monsanto had applied for a patent for 126 rubber vulcanization inhibitor agents, however, only provided data on the testing they had done on 3 of these agents. Now, originally, the Commissioner of Patents said that this patent was invalid on the basis that not all compounds were tested, and therefore you couldn't prove utility. However, it went to the Supreme Court, and they found a ruling favorable for Monsanto, and set out the first specific guidelines of how sound prediction is viewed in Canada. They stipulated that for a prediction to be sound, there cannot be any evidence of a lack of utility with respect to some of the area covered. And they also stipulated that the soundness of the prediction can be attacked and degraded. So that brings us to our case in 2002, which set firmly the 3 requirements of what a sound prediction is. And our case has been cited over 100 times. And while this might not be a relevant number in and of itself, what is relevant is that the Supreme Court actually cited this case 4 times in cases that, in their own regard, have gone on to become landmark. So Kerr alluded to the fact that sound prediction is unique to Canada. So I think it's important now to talk about sound prediction, or at least the analog of sound prediction, in perhaps the most important market in the world, the United States. So both Canada and the United States require that the invention in a patent must be inherently useful. They both require that the patent must be enabling. However, where we differ from the United States is that they do not require any fundamental proof of the utility to be disclosed within the patent. Now, this isn't to say that the U.S. Patent Office won't go out and ask for additional evidence when the utility assertion goes against the generally accepted scientific principles of the time. So this would be if someone tried to patent a perpetual motion machine. Also, in the United States, any litigation focused on the utility of a patent actually focuses on whether that utility is factual, not whether the evidence to support a prediction of that utility was disclosed in the original patent filing. So this begs the question, what does this case do to the strength of pharmaceutical patent protection in Canada? To illustrate this point a little bit, I'm going to talk about Eli Lilly's Strattera, which is a drug that has been approved by both Health Canada and the FDA, and had a patent for in both the US and Canada, and came under litigation in both countries from generic manufacturers on the basis that its utility was not known at the time of filing. However, what's interesting here is that in the United States, the patent was upheld as valid, while in Canada, the patent was deemed invalid. Now let's dig into this a little bit more. So, Eli Lilly's Strattera is a drug approved for the treatment of ADHD, and its original patent was filed on the data that they had researched on 7 weeks clinical data in 22 adults. Now, how did Canada and the US view this patent? Well, in the United States, they deemed the treatment of ADHD as a perfectly practical and reasonable utility to claim for this drug, and deemed it valid. However, in Canada, based on the doctrine of sound prediction that was demonstrated in the case talked about in this presentation, it was deemed that there was an inadequate disclosure of the data, voiding sound prediction in this patent, and thereby invalidating it. Now, this has led to Eli Lilly going to the unprecedented step of filing a notice of arbitration against our government, specifically saying that we've broken our obligations under the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, specifically, they've said that we have failed to ensure a predictable commercial framework for business planning and investment, saying that the sound prediction doctrine makes it inherently unpredictable to file for a patent in this country. And they've also said that we've broken our promise to provide patents that are available and rights that are available without discrimination to the industry. So they're saying that the doctrine of sound prediction unfairly targets the pharmaceutical industry. So, to wrap this all up, in terms of patent strength in Canada and what this case does to it, the answer is very complex. Sound prediction definitely does make Canada unique. And it's determined on a case-by-case basis how the facts of those cases apply to the doctrine of sound prediction. And it is certain that more precedents will be set in the years to come. So now, I'd like to wrap it all back up and answer that initial question that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. It's clear that for this company to enjoy the monopoly that's associated with having patent protection on over 500 disease states, they would need to provide the factual basis, a sound line of reasoning, and proper disclosure for all 500 disease states that they are claiming. So it makes this patent perhaps a little indefensible in the long run, and also a much more complicated endeavor than one would originally think. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your time, and we are very happy to take questions now.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So here's the first question. In terms of the significance of this case, what are the financial implications for both parties in this, from the result of this? How much did Glaxo made from this because of this decision, and how much did Biotech lose from this?
So this case was really interesting because at the time, AZT, it's mentioned on the infographic, AZT was a really expensive drug. It was being sold for a very high price. And that was a little contentious because of the prevalence of AIDS and the public outcry. It would be like someone today selling an Ebola drug for $10,000 a pill. So in terms of a firm number of how many dollars Glaxo Wellcome gained or didn't lose from having this patent invalidated, I couldn't provide you exact data on that. However, it's an interesting ruling, and the Supreme Court was required in this case maybe because of the public pressure. Yeah.
Maybe I have one thing to add to this. Biotech's actually invested a lot of funds in banking on this patent being invalidated. They were at one point producing AZT, so as soon as they filed their suit against G&W, they started production of AZT. And once the judge made the ruling that the patent still is valid, they didn't have to pay G&W anything, but they did lose everything that they had invested into this project because the patent ultimately was not invalidated, right?
Hey, good talk, guys. I had a question for you. Do you think that with this sound prediction, so after this case, were there a lot of other cases that used sound prediction to basically file a patent and have a successful drug?
Right, so that's an interesting point. What we do know is that sound prediction has been a contentious issue. And as I said, it's been cited in over 123 cases, 4 of which have gone on to become very landmark cases in their own right. In terms of how pharmaceutical companies may be approaching, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking how this has affected the patenting strategy in Canada?
Yeah, pretty much. Or another way to word this is, do you think there is a smaller space, I guess, for people to file patents? Since if everybody's using the sound prediction doctrine,
right.
Do you think there's less innovation or patentability in Canada?
So I guess that's interesting because as Kara mentioned, there's got to be that balance between keeping the public sphere uncluttered with ambiguous and patents that have no founding, but also allowing companies to patent their idea without necessarily proving or demonstrating its utility yet. So in terms of making the space smaller, you could actually argue the opposite, that it's allowing companies to file patents with even less firm data, making it easier to go out, as long as the sound line of reasoning and the factual basis is intact.
All right, good presentation, guys. With regards to sound prediction, it's obvious that one of the advantages is that you can file the patent without demonstrating utility, and so you can protect your patent faster. But would you say that perhaps one of the disadvantages is that you actually have less time on the clock to exclusively market the product because the clock starts before the clinical trials?
Right, so filing for the patent before you've conducted clinical trials would reduce the time on market because you would need to conduct clinical trials as your patent protection is running out. However, the question of when to file for a patent is a complicated one that very expensive lawyers make, or decide on. But the important thing is that if you do not file a patent at the time that you first generate data supporting that drug's utility, the chances of another company being out there finding data that could support it and allow them to go patent that drug for whatever use you're looking at, you're running the risk of not being able to sell the drug at all. So it does reduce the time available on market. However, that's the trade-off that lawyers are paid so much to determine.
Thanks for your talk, guys. One quick question off of Stephen's point. Do you know perhaps the trends in filing patents based on that sound prediction doctrine before, during, and after this court case was going on? So how many companies were actually fighting for patents based on this rationale, say before the case was won and then after it was won?
I can handle that question. So in terms of trends, claiming utility in a patent based on a prediction has been going on before our case, as I mentioned. Our case ruling led to a few major impacts in the patent landscape in Canada. First, that generic companies started realizing that they could perhaps open up these patents by litigating on the fact that this newly established sound prediction doctrine doesn't hold up for various patents. So it has definitely affected the landscape in that way, and in terms of how it continues to affect it, the Supreme Court has been a little ambiguous in how they apply this the doctrine of sound prediction. It is not sure one way or the other whether it's going to make it easier or harder to apply for a patent. And what companies are doing to avoid this litigation is really, working hard to make sure they have those three criteria laid out when they make a claim of utility based on a prediction.
And then on the last point you brought up with the Eli Lilly case against the Government of Canada and violation of NAFTA, first, what actual sections of NAFTA were they claiming were broken? And would you say that their claim against the sound prediction model was actually not a claim against that model, but just was their own failing to fully disclose their patent, as you should do in any given patent case?
Right. Okay. So the first part, the actual portions of NAFTA that they're arguing that we failed to uphold. So there are two chapters of NAFTA that are actually applicable here. First is Chapter 11, so that's the investment component of NAFTA. And this is the first point I brought up, that we are required to ensure a predictable commercial framework for which companies can invest and do business in our country. And they're arguing, I think if I understood their notice of arbitration correctly, they're arguing that the sound prediction doctrine makes Canada inherently unpredictable, especially since the SCC rulings have been so inconsistent. The second chapter is Chapter 17, which deals with IP protection, and they're basically arguing that the sound prediction doctrine goes against what Canada and Mexico do typically, and that the pharmaceutical industry is being targeted unfairly, maybe because of the way that pharmaceutical industry needs to generate data to fulfill the doctrine of sound prediction. They're arguing that it is unfair targeting them.
So in this case, it's based on sound prediction. Do you know of any cases where utility has to be demonstrated before filing a patent? And if this case were to do so, what level of evidence will be needed? For example, if it has to carry a human clinical trial, how much data will be required in order to file a patent based on utility?
Okay, so the important thing to note here is that although Canada has established this doctrine of sound prediction, saying that if you're going to make a utility assertion based on a prediction, there's these three requirements. There is nowhere in the Patent Act, either in Canada or the US, that requires you to prove utility. So there's no rigid framework saying that you have clinical trials up to phase 2 or phase 3 or whatever. There's no rigid framework around that. So that would be a precedence that needs to be set in the future if the courts decide that you do need clinical data to file a patent.
Just out of curiosity, have there been any patent invalidations on the basis of inventorship, or was Apotex just grabbing its strings?
All right. I can field this question. Okay, so that's actually a really good question, but essentially the answer is no. And the reason being is because, so as I said, a patent can become void if it's materially misrepresented, if it's willfully done, or if the omission is willfully done. So essentially what that's saying is, at the time that the patent is filed, the company that's filing the patent has to intentionally really basically make a strong point to exclude someone that was a key inventor. And that's never done in pharmaceuticals or really any industry. So essentially that company would have to be really, really, really negligent. And basically, I mean, I might be exaggerating a little bit, but the one case I found was about oil sand drilling in Alberta. And basically the two brothers filed for a patent for drilling into oil sands or a composition of dirt for drilling into oil sands. And basically, they thought that they were inventors, and the court found that they were not actually the true inventors. But in the end, the patent was not voided because it was found that they were not willfully omitting this data. So in the end, it takes a lot of work on the company itself to make the patent invalid on basis of inventorship alone. Usually it's done on utility or the actual what can be patented, but not inventorship, because that's just who was included, right?
Hey guys, so let's go back to the Lilly case. On slide 40, you talked about how their patent was invalidated based on improper disclosure.
Right.
So does that imply that they did have the correct factual basis and sound line of reasoning at the time?
Yes.
And if so, what was that?
So, as I said, they based their patent on the fact that they had 7 weeks of clinical data on 22 people. And this was done in a study. I can't remember the acronym. I think it's MGH study. And they did not include that data in their Canadian patent filing. So this led to the court saying that they did not uphold the disclosure requirement in sound prediction and did not have a sound line of reasoning because of that. It's interesting because in the United States, they take into account the fact that the FDA has approved this drug. It therefore has a utility, of course, and they took into account that the MGH data existed. It didn't matter to them whether it wasn't included in the original patent filing. So, yeah.
You also mentioned that this case was cited in 4 other landmark cases that went on to set precedents. Can you briefly talk about what those were?
Sure. So the 4 Supreme Court cases I mentioned, they're actually a pretty interesting bunch. So first is the second one there, the second bullet point. The most important one is the second bullet point, Monsanto versus Schmeiser. So this was the case where Monsanto was suing a farmer because their seeds had blown over onto his cropland. And Schmeiser, I can't get that name right, he argued that the patent for their seed technology should have been invalidated anyway on the basis of sound prediction, but the SCC did not side with him, unfortunately. So that was definitely a landmark case in its right. Also, an interesting case to draw attention to is the third one, Teva Canada. So Teva is actually Nova Pharm, who was one of the appellants in our case, and they were suing Pfizer over their Viagra patent. And although the SCC ruled that Pfizer didn't meet the requirements of sound prediction, the judges were saying that the case was not in fact about sound prediction, and that was irregardless to their verdict. Even though sound prediction wasn't fulfilled, they in fact upheld the patent. So it's interesting that the SCC's kind of had this wavering application of the doctrine.
I'd like to take a break. I'd like to thank our gun deck. And now we'll open up the questions to the floor.
Hi guys, great presentation today. I have a question for you that may be difficult to answer because you're not lawyers, but just wondering, you had mentioned Dr. Mitsuya's statement regarding that his belief was that the drug was too toxic to use for humans. So it seems a little curious to me that then Apotex wouldn't have argued that he was very skilled in the art and he didn't think that it would be useful. So I'm surprised that that wasn't used as evidence against the utility claim. Can you comment on that?
Okay. So basically, the reason why that was used as, I guess, a reason for why the patent was shouldn't have been upheld was because at the time that the patent was filed, Dr. Mitsuya, he stated in a testimony, I think it was in a journal, basically stating that the whole class, he did not expect whatsoever that there's any utility. And so despite him not identifying that, that doesn't necessarily, because innovations are done on almost a daily basis, right? So Glaxo Wellcome, they might have stumbled upon this by chance, this proposed utility. Therefore, Mitsuya would not have known of it. But because Glaxo Wellcome themselves were the ones that stumbled upon it, and they identified the utility, that would make them inventors. Mitsuya not realizing or identifying does not make, that's not enough to really, I guess, invalidate the whole attack on utility.
I'm not questioning the inventorship portion. I understand that from the inventorship portion. I'm questioning why Apotex didn't then use that information to further attack utility.
Right, so I think I can perhaps address that a little bit better. In order for the soundness of a prediction to be attacked, there needs to be some sort of factual basis to say that there's evidence against the asserted claim. So having a researcher state that, in his opinion, the compound is too toxic to provide a treatment option, would not be viewed as any firm evidence in the eyes of the court.
Other questions? We're quiet tonight. We're going to bounce it back to the gun deck.
I think we have a mic up there.
He already has a mic.
2 mics.
Oh, you got a mic, sorry.
All right, I just have one more question. So the United States Trade Representative, they publish a list of countries to watch out for that have issues with intellectual property. So right now, a big one is India. But Canada actually also appears on that list, on the watch list, specifically due to the requirement for sound prediction in the biotechnology field. And you said just now that the Supreme Court sort of waivers on how they apply this, and the U.S. has certain issues about this. So what do you think can be done sort of to address the U.S. concerns while this is now set in legal precedents in Canada?
So, in my view, the court needs to be much more firm in how they apply the sound prediction doctrine, but also within the cases themselves, they need to be more clear about how they view it in their eyes. A lot of the times when they talk about the doctrine of sound prediction in these cases that I've talked about, the Supreme Court cases that cited Glaxo Wellcome, they always refer to it very ambiguously and talk about exceptions to the rule. And I think that's causing a lot of uncertainty, especially in the pharmaceutical sector, because now you need to worry about whether a patent you filed in the past is going to be invalidated on this newly established doctrine. So I think the Supreme Court needs to do a better job in terms of letting people know what their opinion actually is, and I think they've ignored it a little bit. So that's why in my slide I said that precedents will be set in the years to come, because I think they'll be forced to set it.
Thank you, guys. I just have a quick question. So you did a great job explaining the principle of sound prediction in this case, and certainly this case set a precedent for other cases. So recently, a justice named Justice Snyder explained that sound prediction should not be used as a crushing hammer by those willing to challenge patents, and also that with this case especially, people who are filing patents now are more conscious of the concept of sound prediction, and the patents are more sound themselves. So I'm just wondering, do you have any alternative strategies for companies like Apotex, like Novopharm, if they were to challenge Glaxo Wellcome again, instead of using sound prediction, what strategies can they use?
Right, so I guess we could say that with sound prediction, the crushing hammer, you could try to go around just smashing patents up left and right. And that would be easy, and that would just, create havoc within the patent landscape, and we'd probably get invaded by the U.S. if we did that. But what it comes down to is that patent lawyers and the pharmaceutical industry need to focus on individual claims, try to nitpick every single individual claim within a patent and really put in the hours and really do the work to try to see if every single claim is up to par. And if they can cross out certain claims, like I pointed out in my section, they may be able to weaken the patent, not completely throw it out, but weaken it enough for some sort of workaround solution. Some sort of solution where a generic company can get a piece of the pie in terms of that particular drug in question or something like that. Not completely, destroy the landscape, but carve out a niche for themselves. It makes things more difficult, but there are certainly ways, and the way is to focus on claims now, not the entire patent as a whole, I'd say.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, great presentation. So by following through with your battleship analogy, from my understanding, there seems to be a combination of attack that would have sunk the SSGW. And if we were to extend analogy of saying that utility was, for example, say a Tomahawk missile, and the other two are something lesser, just like ship shells, I'm kind of curious exactly at what combination would have been able to actually defeat this ship.
Missiles are a good bet. Yes, absolutely. You know, fast-moving projectiles. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, something that would have defeated the patent altogether, that really is hard to say. The torpedo was, if utility is not there, then certainly the entire patent topples. The attack on inventorship was really an attack on a technicality. And it's something that the appellants were hoping would have some sort of effect, bringing into play kind of the public outcry at the time as well to sway the judge's ruling. But it was really something that had no precedent in the courts before or after. So yeah, utility, I'd say.
Hey guys, great presentation, nice PowerPoint. So I had one or two questions about the second point in sound prediction, which was sound line of reasoning, and I was just wondering if you can elaborate. So previously the gun deck questioned if there was a sort of threshold for what is considered valuable information for the first point, which was factual basis and data for sound prediction. And you mentioned that there's no real kind of precedent set there. I'm just wondering if there's a similar threshold set for sound line of reasoning in terms of if I have data for one indication and this mechanism has been shown to work for multiple other diseases, would that be enough sound line of reasoning to then patent for the other diseases as well? And who decides that?
Right. So with those cases, it's up to the judge to make a ruling based on testimony of people skilled in the art. It would be a matter of the judge, you know, accumulating a wealth of information and really drawing the line in the sand. It's very hard to answer that. In my example with HTLV1, 2, and human foamy-virus, there was sufficient testimony to say that HIV and those three viruses are significantly different, even though they have one overriding common characteristic. So it's really something that has to be analyzed, you know, with considering every single piece of evidence, every single fact, and it's something that can't be, in a way, I guess, predicted, if lack of a better word. It's something that has to be tried case by case by case.
And just kind of a similar question referring to sound line of reasoning is that, to my understanding, AZT is off patent, at least as a monotherapy for HIV right now. Yes. But the recent trend for HIV treatment is the use of combination therapies and fixed dose combination therapy in pills, which have multiple treatment drugs using multiple mechanisms. Right. So in the court's eye, how do they see that in terms of the area of sound line of reasoning? Would it be reasonable to say that because this mechanism works as a monotherapy, that when I mix it with two other different mechanism of action drugs, that it would still work in an HIV patient?
So it's kind of interesting. One of the eureka moments that we had in analyzing this case is realizing that in terms of the sound line of reasoning and the disclosure requirements of sound prediction, they're really talking about a form of enablement. So given the information that you've disclosed in the patent and the logic that you've displayed in the patent, could someone else skilled in the art follow the same line of reasoning and land at the same conclusion that you could? So in terms of combination therapies and whether or not that would fulfill the requirements for sound prediction, it would really be up to, in the court case, whether someone skilled in the art could look at the very specific details that were disclosed in the patent. Not evidence outside of the patent, but everything that was in the patent, and say whether or not that could be predicted based on that evidence. It's a enablement in a way, and it's kind of important to understand that.
I wonder if you can provide me a little bit more background on what the standard sort of supporting information to file a patent was in Canada before this point. My understanding is that we never would have been waiting for clinical trials to complete a phase 1 trial before we're filing a patent. So, I understand this was the first case that kind of discussed what you need for sound prediction, but was what was presented in this case representative of what was being filed at the time for any given drug?
The way that we understood it is that prior to this case, we were very much in line with the United States in that there was no requirement for proof of the utility you were claiming. It was governed on more of a case-by-case basis based on common sense and generally accepted scientific principles. Clinical data was not required, I don't believe. But it's interesting that Canada has taken this step is really the important thing in this case because the United States hasn't, and they seem to be doing just fine. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey guys, great presentation. I learned a lot. Just a quick point of clarification that might have just went over my head. What is the point at all of tackling inventorship? Like, what would that even do to the patent, even if it was invalidated? The claim of inventor, like the issue of inventorship, if that was, they had omitted someone, what would the impact be?
So I guess I didn't, to really clarify, it goes back to Section 53 within the Patent Act. And if they can prove that both it was a material misrepresentation and that was omitted willfully, the whole patent would become completely void, entirely. And so then the appellants would be able to freely produce AZT and sell it. So because inventorship wasn't upheld and it wasn't shown to be materially misrepresented, that didn't happen. And so inventorship really didn't do anything, but it was the potential to completely invalidate the patent.
Great, thanks.
And it also goes on the flip side as well, if I'm not mistaken, guys. If someone's included on the patent application, it shouldn't be there. All right, just a few questions before we wrap up. Dosing. So how do we use sound prediction to claim dosing? What do we expect? When we look at a patent, do we expect to see 6 claims for each specific dose? How does this work?
Right. So this is how we understood sound prediction with regards to dosing. It's a little more ambiguous, and it wasn't actually brought up in our case, but it's interesting to look how it might affect a dosage claim. So the way we understood it is that on the bottom here you have whatever data you had to support your sound prediction in the first place. And say it was on a 300 milligram dose. You could use sound prediction to claim in your patent that you have a dose range of 10 to 1,000 milligrams, say. And these are all numbers that we just completely made up. But where this becomes relevant is that you want to use sound prediction to claim a dose range as wide as possible so that other companies couldn't come and repatent your drug with a slightly different dose. But at the same time, in claiming a broad range of doses, it's difficult to soundly predict. It gets more difficult to soundly predict as you go up. That's how we understood it. And then if you were to claim on a new patent that, say you wanted to sell for 5,000 milligram dosage, you'd need to have new data which would be supported through a sound prediction to claim that dose.
Okay. Thank you. So let's just build on this a bit. And if I go out of scope here, guys, just call me on it. So what about pediatric dosing?
Right. We were perhaps expecting this question. It really, in terms of the scope of this presentation, it had nothing to do with what our case was about or the precedent set. It's an interesting point because pediatric dose is, I believe it's the ability to extend your patent by 6 months if you claim a dosage in children, kind of to encourage companies to do so.
Sorry, if I could just jump in on that. So
yeah.
I was talking about something slightly differently, but just on that point. So you're right. On the U.S., they get, as I understand it, a 6-month patent extension if they conduct the clinical work. Not by filing a claim, but if they conduct the clinical work. But in this case, with putting clinical work aside, you read the patent and it's talking about adults, but it never made reference to children. Or maybe just talking about humans. Let's say it's talking about humans. So you read the patent, it's talking about humans, and someone wants to file the drug now in children. They want to lay claim to using the drug in children. Would that be anticipated through sound prediction by the original patent, which just talked about humans? Would humans be known through sound prediction to include children and adults when we're talking about the action of a drug?
So I suppose if you could argue you had a sound line of reasoning that the data and the utility in humans could be extended to children, and you had access to that data and you were able to disclose it in your own patent for a childhood dose, I suppose sound prediction would, as long as the sound reasoning is intact, would work. However, I think what you'd get into trouble there with is whether or not that claim of a new dose in children would be novel enough to warrant a patent. That would be more of the issue, I think, just based on what I understand of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you guys talked about this before. I think, maybe just revisit the issue for the benefit of all of us. When you're making an attack on sound prediction, it's based on the time of filing, or is it a moving target after filing?
So in Canada, which is the only relevant country to be talking about here, it needs to be, you can attack the soundness of the prediction only at the time of filing. Any data that the company has generated since the patent filing that may support their prediction cannot be used at all.
Okay. And I think this is my last question. This goes on broad claims. I missed the point about Mitsuya finding, you said his evidence of lack of utility was not admissible for the broad claim argument because he was not a co-inventor. I missed that entirely.
Okay, so within this patent, Glaxo Wellcome filed evidence, so clinical laboratory work conducted by Dr. Mitsuya with human cells infected with HTLV1, so human T lymphotropic virus 1. And he did publish evidence that AZT would be effective in this case. So it's not lack of utility, but utility. However, this evidence was included in the patent, but Dr. Mitsuya had conducted this research on his own accord, independent of Glaxo Wellcome. But Glaxo Wellcome cited it as if it were part of the contracted work that the National Institute of Health did for them. So based on the fact that Dr. Mitsuya was not cited as a co-inventor, and the fact that Glaxo Wellcome had never asked these scientists to do work on HTLV1, the judge concluded that there was no room for this piece of evidence in the patent. It wasn't Glaxo Wellcome's to include.
Gotcha. Okay.
If it was included, just a side note, it probably wouldn't have contributed to this ruling. These viruses have been shown to be significantly different, and they would have needed at least more than just that one study.
Okay.
Right.
Our gun deck did a good job tonight. Good questions from our audience tonight. And most importantly, I'd like to thank our team for their presentation tonight.